findings suggest that the laboratory incident hypothesis is extremely unlikely and to explain the introduction of the virus into the human population.
This seems to be the consensus after a controversial joint investigation into the origin of coronavirus by the WHO and Chinese government in Wuhan. So where did the virus come from? The prevalent theory is that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is a zoonosis, that it jumped from animals to humans, either from close contact with these creatures or the hunting of exotic wildlife. So, case closed? Not quite. Questions remain. Indeed. Welcome to our COVID-19 special. I'm Monica Jones in Berlin. Now, it took a year for China to allow an international investigation into the origin of the coronavirus, and then only in a joint mission with Chinese experts. Is Beijing trying to hide something? Now, it wouldn't be the first time that China's handling of exotic animals led to the birth of a deadly virus.
Wild animals in cages, many of them injured and weak. It's filthy and cramped, and the animals are in close contact with humans. The coronavirus may have started to spread in an animal market like this. It's the perfect breeding ground for new diseases.
Markets like this provide an opportunity for pathogens to make the leap from one species to another. In the process, the pathogen can develop characteristics that make it easier to spread to a third species, in this case, to humans.
Experts have long been warning that the trade in wild animals could be a ticking time bomb. More than 2/3 of infectious diseases that affect humans originate in wildlife. Those include deadly diseases such as the Ebola virus, SARS and HIV. Scientists call such diseases zoonotic because they originate in animals.
Zoonotic diseases can be dangerous because the pathogen can develop new capabilities in its new host. The new host has no immunity, so infection can often lead to serious disease.
The coronavirus pandemic has thrust these wild animal markets into the spotlight. Around the world, many are calling for a total ban. The animals are sold not just for food for private households. Some species are sold to make traditional medicines or aphrodisiacs. Others end up as pricey delicacies on restaurant menus. Animal protection activists like these in Vietnam say that the only way to reduce the risk of pandemics is to ban the commercial trade in wild animals.
Viruses don't really make a distinction, along the entire trade chain. They don't make a distinction whether the trade is legal or illegal, whether the trade is for bushmeat, for food, for medicine, or as exotic pets.
Activists agree. The desire for an exotic pet is part of the problem. There's a flourishing illegal online trade in them, especially involving reptiles. But wild mammals are also sold online illegally. They pose the highest risk for transmitting viruses to humans. China has now temporarily suspended the trade and consumption of wild animals. But as long as the worldwide market exists, the threat of new emerging viruses will continue.
And Professor Fabian Lendertz, you've just seen him in this report. He supported the investigation into the origin of the coronavirus, and he joins us now. Good to have you with us. You are project group leader of epidemiology of highly pathogenic microorganisms at the Robert Koch Institute here in Berlin. What was your role in Wuhan?
Well, I was asked to join the team as an expert on zoonotic diseases. So I have the technical expertise. We are looking since many years for the source of human disease in wildlife, normally mainly in the tropics in African context.
So is it a given now, after this joint mission looking into the origin of the coronavirus, is it a given now that the virus has actually been transmitted from animal to human? And did all of that happen in China?
Well, I think everybody would agree that it's a given that the virus comes from an animal ultimately and then infected humans, because we didn't know it from the human population before. So that's That's clear. The question is now which species exactly were involved, and how did the transmission happen. The where is perhaps less relevant in that context, but that's obviously also on the agenda.
And those questions you just raised, do we know the answer now? Which species and how?
No, we have very little evidence at the moment which species are involved. The only thing we know is that the closest relatives of the origin of SARS-CoV-1, of this 2 of the virus, is found in certain bat species in Southeast Asia. So that's a suspicious range of species to look at and a suspicious region to look at as well. But all the other data are not really leading to a very good hypothesis at the moment.
All right. If you say that the where it comes from is basically not interesting, why do you think China was so hesitant allowing international investigators into the country in the first place?
Well, I think these kinds of missions, if they're set up on a political level, they always take quite some time because it's an international effort. There is a Chinese team, there is an international team working together jointly. And so it took some time. I don't have the details why exactly, so this would be a question to ask to the WHO. But I think also people have to understand that in the beginning of the epidemic and later pandemic, people were busy fighting the epidemic. And the question of where it came from and so on is something which is perhaps not top priority right from the start.
I still have to ask you that question, though. I mean, because there is this theory that the virus came from a lab, even though an animal in the lab, presumably. Can this theory now be ruled out, or are there still question marks?
So the lab theory is extremely difficult to completely rule out. Because technically that's a very big challenge. However, the likelihood that this has happened is extremely low. If you consider how intensive we have contacts between wildlife and humans, intermediate host, farmed wildlife and humans, this simply seems to be the least likely scenario. So I think we should investigate now the scenarios which are the most likely ones, and then later we may still come back to the other hypothesis.
All right, then let's stick to the transmission from animal to human. I mean, even here in Germany, of course, we do have virus spillover from rodent to human, for example, every year. So when does the transmission of a virus from animal to human become a real problem, like the one we're now seeing with this pandemic?
So, yeah, as you say, there are frequent transmissions, and it's not only viruses. If you think about salmonella or E. coli infections, like in the food industry, that's frequently a problem, right? So, and that's a severe problem we have. So the question now why sometimes a virus turns into an epidemic or pandemic virus really depends on the property of the virus in the first place. So is it something easily transmittable from human to human? So, for example, hantaviruses, which you find also in Germany, transmitted from rodent to humans, are not well transmitted between humans. So we are simply lucky that the virus doesn't have the property like the SARS virus has now. So that's one of the important factors, or the most important factors, I would say.
And of course, I mean, we've seen it in the past that wildlife trade, wet markets, they've repeatedly been found to be the source of deadly diseases, but they continue to exist. What can we do about that?
Yeah, that's a very complex issue. You really have to differentiate which region you're looking at. For example, if you take the inhabitants in African forests or other rainforests who are doing traditional hunting to feed themselves and the family, I don't think that's a real problem if nature is intact enough to live with that, right, the animal population. But then when you think about the big commercial trade, the big demand for bushmeat in the big cities in Africa and Asia, then that's obviously a more complicated field. And to my opinion, lots of that would not be needed. However, it's also in the tradition of many of the people there to eat these kinds of things. So trying to break traditions, it's very, very difficult. Tell the Germans to not eat the Schweinehaxe. So we would have big problems to convince people to do that.
Well, you can easily convince me, because I've been a vegetarian for many years, but I do get your point. Lastly, I mean, why does it actually matter to know the origin of the virus? I mean, would it actually help us fight the current pandemic?
it does not help to fight the current pandemic, but it helps to reduce the risk of future pandemics to happen. And these kinds of pandemics have happened since many, many years, all the time. Think about HIV, think about even measles come from an animal origin. So we will continue seeing these kinds of things. So you can only solve a problem if you have understood it fully, and then you can take the right countermeasures to reduce the risk of spillover events. So this is what we need. And we need that from all the outbreaks happening, not only the very prestigious one as this one, but we need to understand the mechanisms, because then we can do something to reduce the risk.
All right. And there's still a lot to learn from the current SARS-CoV-2 virus, I understand. Fabienne Lendertz, Project Group Leader of Epidemiology of Highly Pathogenic Microorganisms at the Robert Koch Institute. Thank you so much for your time. Now, from the virus to the solution, vaccines. Time for your questions, and over to Derek Williams.
Will approved vaccines be as effective against new variants of SARS-CoV-2 as they were against the old one?
The hope is they will be. The fear is they won't be. There's been a lot of conflicting information churned out on this topic already, and with around a dozen different vaccines approved in various parts of the world at the moment, and new variants being identified seemingly every day, that mountain of conflicting information just grows and grows. The most striking report so far that a new variant was steamrolling over a vaccine came from South Africa. The small study it was based on left some open questions, but it did indicate pretty strongly that the AstraZeneca vaccine didn't do a very good job of preventing mild or moderate disease caused by a variant in wide circulation in the country. That evidence was enough to prompt the South African government to decide to start using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine on its health workers instead. So yes, there are signs that new variants could have an impact on effectiveness in some vaccines, but I'd like to add my voice to a growing chorus that includes many researchers who worry that all the hyped up reporting on variants and studies involving them is actually counterproductive, not only because it frightens people, but that it does so most of the time for no good reason. The vaccines currently approved are based on a range of different platforms that stimulate the immune system in different ways. Some of them might prove less effective against new variants, others more so. The thing is, even when the virus changes, which it will continue to do, we can respond, like the government in South Africa, by switching tracks. We now also have the technical ability to tweak some vaccines quickly to respond to mutations in the virus. So I, at least, have come to a decision not to let any fears about new variants keep me up at night.
Derek Williams there. And speaking of switching tracks, the German government has just approved AstraZeneca for people over the age of 65. The vaccine from British-Swedish pharmaceutical has so far been only deemed safe for people under 65. The government hopes the new rule will help speed up vaccination here in Germany. And that's it for today. From me and the team here in Berlin, thanks for keeping us company.